It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Sumner. He is a professor of English and Environmental Studies at Linfield University. And when he's not teaching or writing, he likes to wander wild places of the West with his family and his fly rod and play bluegrass with his bandmates, the Bootleg Jam. Thank you, Dave. He's going to be, his sermon is entitled Ad Bellum Purificandum. I hope I'm saying that right, Purificandum. Or No More Sticks and Stones, Let's Just Dance.
Thanks for having me here. I'm excited about this. It's fun to sing hymns. I grew up singing hymns in church, and it's been a long time. And it's fun to see some new faces and some familiar faces. You know, Bryn, I think you were one of my advisees at one time, right? Well, it's been like a decade, but yeah. So it's good to see familiar faces. As was mentioned, the title of my talk is Ad Bellum Purificandum, or No More Sticks and Stones, Let's Dance. And I will explain this as we go. Ad Bellum Purificandum is Latin for the purification of war. And this is the motto one of my favorite rhetorical theorists had taken a crayon and written over the sash in his window. And his idea was that if we can move to words from fists or sticks and stones or ICBMs or anything like that, we are going to be better off as a race and better off as people. And I'm going to push his argument a little further that we need to actually move from the idea of argument as war, and we need to think of it using a different metaphor. We need to think of it as dance, and I'll talk about that just a little bit. But before I get into that, I want to kind of define some terms and kind of set us on a path or a foundation that we can move forward. And the real thing that I'm here for, at least the real thing I hope is accomplished here, is I would argue each one of us needs to establish our own personal set of rhetorical ethics. And we need to decide how we approach other human beings when we disagree and what the most ethical way to do that is. And that's going to be the topic, is some ideas about things we can establish as our own set of ethical rules and how we conduct discourse with others. And hopefully get you thinking about this so that you can explore these ideas further yourselves and think about these further. But to get started, we have to realize that this question, first I have to define some terms, right? So the first thing I want to define is argument. Often I think that we think of argument as fighting or as disagreeing in a bad way. You know what? I'm going to start my clock so that I don't, because I've only prepared 3 hours of stuff. So let me set this so that I know how long I'm going. Okay, good. So for me, argument is actually a very positive thing. I've never learned anything from anybody I agreed with. And so if we can engage in argument in the right way, and we can engage in argument from the right ontological and epistemological position, fancy words, we'll talk about them, we are going to be much more able to ethically engage one another and to solve some of these intractable problems. I don't think any of us need to think very far to think about difficulties that our culture is having right now, arguing about all kinds of things. And some of the arguments are going on in really deadly ways right now, which hurts my heart. And others are going on in deceptive and ways that aren't concerned with truth, which also hurts my heart. So I want to talk about how we can approach this and not engage in these arguments that way, but engage in a positive way, in a way that builds community and does not divide it, in a way that moves us towards understanding rather than moves us away from it, in a way that crosses boundaries between tribes rather than creating and solidifying them. And so that's really going to be the topic that I'm talking about today. I'm hoping you guys can start to think about your own lives and how you make arguments and how productive they are and how ethical they are. Okay, so let me just, for just a little bit, I want to talk about the Greeks because we get all of rhetorical ethics from the Greeks. And really what's happening at about 300 BCE in Athens is that democracy is forming, and all of a sudden they need to learn how to communicate. If you're in a monarchy, you do what the monarch says. If you're a democracy, we have to negotiate together as citizens and do things as citizens. And so this group of people come into Athens at this time called the Sophists. And my guess is you've heard of the Sophists before. If you read Plato's dialogues, Plato picks a favorite sophist and then shows how they're wrong. Most of the information we get about the Sophists comes through Plato. He hated them. That will give you an idea. But there's some significant differences between the Sophists and between the Platonic, what I would call the Platonic philosophers, and what I would say are the Aristotelian line. And I would argue, I'm going to argue for the Aristotelian line, and anyway, but we'll go there. So the Sophists come to Greece, they come to Athens because they're teachers of speech. And there are men who need to go, and it's only men because the Greeks had some other ethical problems, but at this time it's the emergence of democracy, and they have to go into the assembly and be able to persuade one another and be able to talk to one another. So the Sophists come and they start to teach persuasive speech. But the problem with this is that the Sophists, people like Gorgias and people like Protagoras, their assumption was there was no truth, there was only doxa, there was only opinion. And so for them, their only concern was to be the most persuasive, no matter what the situation was, because opinion was the only thing. Now, you can imagine this would be disagreed with by some. Plato was one of the people who disagreed with them the most. But Plato had his problems as well. Plato believed in absolute truth with a big T. And so he called the Sophists skilled liars, which they really actually were. And he didn't like what they were doing, but his answer was so extreme the other way that there is absolute truth, and that you can find it through dialectic and through philosophy or praying to the gods. But that is refreshing that he recognizes that truth exists, but it's scary when you put a big T on it and when it's absolute. So we've got these two situations in Athens where we've got the Sophists who don't believe that there is any truth, and we've got Plato who believes that there is absolute truth, and I must convince you of it. Now, the problem, we can see the problem with the Sophists, but the problem with Plato is if you absolutely believe you're right, if you believe that you know exactly what the answer is, does that allow space for you to engage with your interlocutor? Does that provide space for you to change your mind? Does that provide space for conversation and for what I would call argument in the best sense of the word? So Aristotle, student of Plato, comes along, and Aristotle doesn't like the Sophists. He thinks that there is an ethical way to go through the world, and just persuading is not and winning is not the only way. But he has a problem with the Platonic idea of absolute truth. And really, Aristotle comes to the conclusion of what I would call a small t truth. So in other words, he would say maybe absolute truth exists, but instead of focusing on that ontological question, what is real and what exists, he concentrates on an epistemological question, which is method. And he says, even if it does exist, our access to it is very limited and very flawed. And therefore, what we need to do is we need to have a way that we can change our mind, we can engage, we can think through these problems, and that there are a lot of problems that we have in our lives that don't speak to absolute truth anyway. There are problems that experience inform us about. There are problems that emotion inform us about. And it's hard to see how absolute truth might tell us whether or not to have voted for that the tax thing for the fire department, for instance, right? So that absolute truth doesn't seem to. It seems to me you have to argue about whether or not it's better for the culture or not. And Aristotle was much more interested in that. And really, rhetoric. He wrote a book called On Rhetoric. And rhetoric, all of kind of the conversations and the arguments about rhetoric for 2,000 years now come from those arguing with Plato, with Protagoras and Gorgias, who are two Sophists, and with Aristotle. And every other rhetorician you can divide into one of those four categories. They kind of fit into those four categories. So they really laid out the foundation for this. But if Aristotle is right, and I confess, I'm an Aristotelian, if Aristotle is right, and it's worth looking for truth, but we can't be too confident that we have access to it. We've got an epistemological problem, which is we are finite human beings. Then how are we then able to move forward? How are we able to engage? And rhetoric is the way we do that. But it requires us to be effective, to be humble. It requires a certain humility. And so what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about a few of the principles that rhetoric can help us with, and that you could establish perhaps if you think that they're worthwhile as principles of rhetorical ethics. And then I want you guys to think more about what you might add to it, or why you might see these ethics not the right ones, but argue to me why, because I'd love to change my mind if I'm wrong. All of these kinds of things. And then I'm going to finish off by reading an op-ed I wrote and sent to the New York Times, and they rejected it, and I sent it to the Washington Post, and they rejected it. So you guys are the ones that are here. All right? And it's about community and how we must establish community first before we can really have good rhetorical exchange. So let me start with my first principle. The first principle that I abide by is the principle of fallibility. And this comes partially from Aristotle's view of truth, but it comes really more strongly from the American pragmatist. It comes more strongly from Charles Peirce and William James and those who were dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War. And the reason, here's what I mean by fallibility. The thing I know for sure is that I am able to be wrong. I don't know if I'm able to be right for sure, but I do know I'm able to be wrong. And I would argue that because we're finite human beings with finite minds and finite lives, and things like confirmation bias and other kinds of things like that, our ability to be wrong is probably the strongest ability we have. And if you accept that, that gives you the space to listen to others. That gives you the space to be willing to change your position. I would also say that most people think that is exactly the stance everybody else should adopt. And it's important to note, it's easy to say, I can't believe they're so stubborn and won't change their mind. It's harder to say, where am I not changing my mind? Where am I not listening? Where am I holding on to some absolute truth that probably I don't know is absolute? And this is one of the things that I think fallibility offers us. And if you have this as the basis, it's really difficult to hurt somebody. It's really difficult to throw a rock if you know that you're fallible. It takes a certain confidence to throw that rock. Now, objections to this. People will say, well, look, there are some things that are right. There are some things that we need to stand up for. There are some times we need to speak truth to power. All of that is true. But most of the time, if we are going to do that, we need to really do some self-examination first. And we need to be open. We need to be able to articulate the other side in a way the other side is comfortable with and that they will accept. And the second thing is most of our interactions aren't speaking truth to power. I don't need to speak truth to power when I have a discussion with my brother. I don't need to speak truth to power when I have a discussion with my neighbor. What I need to do is I need to think about the level of community, and I need to think about how those relationships fit in to the way I'm interacting with the world. And that gets me to my second, and I think in many ways most important point, which is one of the biggest flaws in current rhetorical engagement, in my view, is something that Wayne Booth, who was a critic at the University of Chicago, and who I was going to bring to Linfield. And we had it all arranged, and it was sad. This is sad. He was in his 80s, and he was excited to come, and then he wasn't able to come because the health finally passed away. But I was so excited to get this guy to come to Linfield early in my career because he was such a giant. But he says he was the dean of students at University of Chicago during the Vietnam War, and he saw on campus the faculty who basically sympathized with the students and the students who were very radically making these arguments not able to talk to each other. And he wondered why. He's like, why are they so suspicious of one another? Their approaches are a little different, but they're not that far different, you know? And he came up with this idea of motivism. And this is what we mean. How often have you had an argument with someone, and when you disagree with them, instead of going to the reasons they present, you go to their motives? Oh, he argues that because he's a racist. Or he doesn't believe that because he won't listen to me because he's this, or he's that, or he's the other. And we go to motives, right? Why is that a problem? One is, can you ever know anybody else's motives? Is that possible? It seems to me impossible. We can guess, but we only have the reasons they've offered. We can say, well, the reasons this person offers shows that the result is going to have racist results. That's legit. That's different than calling the person's motives racist. And they might be, they might not. We can't know, but if we call them that, we can't continue the conversation. For me, that's the most important thing. It's not that race and all these other things aren't important. Is it more important to be effective than to feel right? And I think it's way more important to be effective. And it's way more important to engage in these things. And think about this as well. Think about if someone were arguing motives to you. You offer a sincere argument, you present your reasons, and they say about you that, oh, we can't accept those reasons because we know the secret motives. Is that a way you would like to be treated or have your argument treated? So this is something that we're willing to do to everybody else, but offends us when it happens to us, which seems to me to say we shouldn't do it. And we should approach argument differently. And we should approach what these folks are saying differently. Okay, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to keep going. We got 90 minutes? No, I've got one more point, and then I want to read this essay. And have some time for a little bit of conversation, I hope. The last thing that I want to talk about is metaphors. And if we think about we're fallible, if we think about fallibilism as a way to start, our own fallibilism as a way to start, and so if we think about avoiding motivism and accusing people, and this idea of levels of community, who do we most communicate with? I think that gets us on a good road towards thinking about the more ethical way to engage with human beings and to persuade them. And sometimes the best engagement is not to engage. Sometimes the best engagement is to work on the relationship so that engagement might be effective at another time. But finally, the metaphors matter. And Lakoff and Johnson are both philosophy professors at UVO, at least they were, I hope they still are. And they wrote a book called The Metaphors We Live By. And what they argue is the metaphors we choose to frame things make all the difference. And their argument is that all of the metaphors for argument are war metaphors. Attack, defend, win, lose, victory. And Johnson and Lakoff say, what if we switch dance as a metaphor in for argument instead of war? I mean, dancers cooperate, right? Dancers move together. Dancers work together. And so one of the things I would like you to think about is don't think about winning an argument. Think about dancing with the person you're speaking with. And thinking about how you can move forward, not that egotistically driven idea of winning. If you win, does it benefit you? What do you benefit? In fact, to be honest with you, to keep the war metaphors for a minute, I'm better off when I lose because I learned something, right? If I win, who cares? I learned nothing. And so I think and then if we switch that to dance, we can see it as cooperation of both of us, helping to understand more deeply and better and moving together. Okay, so please think about some of these concepts, and please think about how you engage with others about tough things. The things we talk about are tough. I'm not saying don't talk about it. I'm saying how do we do so in a way that preserves community, that moves us actually towards something that makes society better, and that can help us overcome these other kinds of obstacles. And to that end, I want to read this essay, and then I will call it, and we'll be done. It's a short essay. It's called Bluegrass Can Heal Our National Divisions. You expected this, right? With the noise of the second Trump indictment broadcasting on my truck's radio and citizens again retreating to their partisan corners, I hauled my guitar to the local Mexican restaurant, sat in a circle, and jammed with 12 or so other amateur musicians. While division roiled the country, ratcheting up the discord, we created harmony. To the 1-5 thump of the stand-up bass, we passed around the league to Whiskey Before Breakfast and to St. Anne's Reel, sang parts, sure I'll take tenor, to Old Home Place and to My Little Cabin Home. We drank our Pacificos and we enjoyed catching up with friends. This group is a diverse one. It includes old hippies, retired bankers, conservative Christians, members of the LGBTQ plus community. This ragtag assembly sometimes is in sync, sometimes a bit syncopated, bears witness to the power of a thoroughly American music, which is bluegrass. Bluegrass is a mix of influences that blends all the complicated joy, hope, heartache, sweat, and violence of our shared history. Banjo sounds that the enslaved people brought from West Africa blend with the fiddle tunes and the ballads of poor immigrants carried from the British Isles. Then, in the hollers of Appalachia, it all mixed with the harmonies of the black church and the work songs of the coal mines and the jilted jealousy of murder ballads and the whiskey fumes of clandestine stills. Bluegrass fans don't just listen, they play the music. At a bluegrass festival, audience members often carry mandolins, dobros, basses, guitars, and when the performers finish on stage, they frequently wander into the parking lot and campgrounds to join a jam, to make music with their fans. In 2016, at just such a festival, I found myself talking with Dr. Banjo, Pete Warnick, at a barbecue. He's famous in the community, and he's the picker for Hot Rise, one of the top acts since the 70s. And in true bluegrass style, he was happy just to chat. I told him I appreciated the workshop he'd given on jamming that morning, and he said, thanks. That's the only way I know to work towards world peace. Put an instrument in people's hands, sit them in a circle, teach them to play chords, and sing harmony. It makes it hard to hate each other then. Every Tuesday night for the past 10 years has been a testament to Pete's truth. At last Tuesday night, following an historically divisive day, I made music with some folks who viewed the day's events the same way as I did, and some who didn't. Why does that matter, you might ask? You're not talking politics with these people. You're just strumming your guitar and playing some old, worn-out folk tunes way out in Oregon. When you go to the ballot box, your votes will just cancel each other out. I'll tell you why it matters. It matters because this group has introduced me to my neighbors. And if one of them gets sick or needs a hand, I know the others will help. But more importantly, when religious or political differences do come up, we know and care about each other as human beings. It's hard to get in a shouting match at a city council or a school board meeting with somebody whose humanity you have felt, whose personhood you've seen. It's harder to use your vote to take the rights away from someone with whom you've sung harmony. It's not a perfect solution, and not the only one, but there's wisdom in Dr. Banjo's prescription. So pick up a guitar, a mandolin, learn a few chords, gather your neighbors, make some music. In G, 1-4-5, yeah, I'll sing tenor to your lead. Questions or not?
Yes, we can do a meditation, or we can...
You tell me. I'll do what you tell me.
Okay, let's just go straight into dialogue if everybody's okay with that. Okay. So now we're just going to have brief time for reflection on what Dave has presented with us today and what it has stirred up in you. If you have a question or if you were particularly touched by some insight during service and you want to say a word or discuss something, now's the time to raise your hand.